Good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining this morning and welcome to Camwood's review of Microsoft Inspire 2021. My name is James Churchill. I'm Camwood's Head of Sales, and joining me today is Camwood's Head of Technology, Daniel Williams. And over the next 45 minutes or so, we'll look to cover off all of the key announcements from Microsoft's annual event, Inspire. And as you can see here from the agenda, we'll start off just with a quick recap, a quick refresher for those who need it, as to what Microsoft Inspire actually is, before moving on to those major announcements. And as you can see there, we've highlighted some that we're going to look to cover off today. That's going to be Microsoft's Windows 365, their dubbed Cloud PC, before moving on to some recent updates with regards to Azure Virtual Desktop. We'll then talk about Microsoft 365 Lighthouse, which is their admin portal for managed service providers, to enable them to provide services to M365 customers, before finishing off with Microsoft's sustainability initiatives and what the roadmap looks like there. And of course, at the end, we'll leave enough time for any questions. And on that point, if you do have any questions at all, please do put it in the chat box. We'll pick that up at the end and we'll cover off those answers for you. So with that, I'll pass over to Dan now, who will quickly recap on what Microsoft Inspire is. Thank you.
Excellent. Thanks very much, James. Appreciate that. Good morning, everyone. Good to see everyone here. So yeah, as James sort of alluded to, we'll kick off initially around sort of what Microsoft Inspire is. Microsoft tend to do a lot of conferences throughout the year, and it can get a little bit confusing in terms of what is actually on offer and ultimately what's been sort of talked about. So Microsoft Inspire, really, in sort of summary, is a partner event. It's a partner-driven event. So Microsoft are all about sort of partner engagement and how partners can help customers. So what Inspire is sort of typically enabled to do is to allow customers to showcase what they've had on offer in terms of the last 12 months with their existing customers, any sort of major customer success stories they've had. So customers that have either sort of transitioned from one solution over to a Microsoft solution, or ultimately made more out of what is available within the Microsoft solution stack as well. Now, sort of typically, these are held sort of in person once a year in Las Vegas, which I'm sure is sort of a massive disappointment to a lot of partners out there that it's not being held there. However, you know, flipping to a virtual world has actually made it a little bit more accessible for most partners now. So it's kind of a good and a bad thing at the same time, where it's good to, you know, actually meet people in person, shake hands, etc. It's a lot more beneficial for some of those partners that can't attend physically in some of those events. But like I said, Inspire is all really about sort of the partners and ultimately what they've done for customers. This is where they really sort of set aside time and sort of align everything in terms of major product announcements, which we're going to be talking through in a bit, and ultimately sort of what the plans are moving forwards for the next sort of 12 months. So that's sort of the underlying sort of tone of what it is. And then the final one is really to talk about sort of partner winners. So they have lots and lots of different categories in terms of where partners have done really well. So they'll have geographical location partner awards, they'll have specific solution stack awards, and sort of Camwood are driving to see if we can get on that list as well. But ultimately, this is where partners sort of showcase what they've done within that sort of space. So just talking through some of the major announcements, there's probably too many to talk about in sort of one single session, because Microsoft released a lot of products, a lot of sort of system integration from that perspective. So what I've done is break down sort of 6 key ones what we're seeing from a one workplace perspective, and then we've got more specific ones as we dive a little bit deeper into the presentation and the webinar itself. So starting off with the top left, I think it's sort of quite plain to see that Microsoft Teams has been a staple for everyone working in a remote working world, and obviously the pandemic's still going on. Hybrid working is still very much a focus, and ultimately off the back of, or coming out of the back of the pandemic, which we hopefully are now, we don't think that that's going to change too much from a hybrid working model. There's still going to be offices, there's still going to be people working from home. It's about really sort of finding a really good balance in between. And ultimately, Microsoft have sort of pumped a lot of resource and sort of driving everyone down the Microsoft Teams route. And one of the pieces that they've done around the collaboration applications within Microsoft Teams is actually fantastic. So everyone's familiar with, you know, the instant messaging, the fact that you can get Yammer in there, you can get insights, you can integrate your sort of calendar, your Outlook calendar into it, which is fantastic. But ultimately, what Microsoft have done now is work with a lot of ISV and sort of major partners, companies like SAP, Salesforce, Workday, all of those different partners, and actually they've created native applications for Microsoft Teams. So it's very much a case of Microsoft sort of driving down the Microsoft Teams route to become your single point of truth for productivity, and working with all these partners, ensuring that they've got collaboration applications directly linked into their products is going to be absolutely key. Next one, migration programs. So everyone's probably familiar with the AMP program, which was the Azure migration program. So Microsoft set aside set amounts of funding sort of every year to give to partners to help customers move into Microsoft Azure or Microsoft 365. Microsoft has sort of rebadged it and relabeled it and rescoped that particular AMP program. Now they're calling it AMMP. So that's the Azure Modernization Migration Program. So the acronyms can get a little bit confusing, but ultimately from an understanding perspective, it's not just about moving server workloads anymore. It's about moving data. It's about moving analytics. It's about moving server infrastructure as we used to. And it's also about moving associated workloads as well. So it's not just server infrastructure anymore, moving from A to B. It's about the transformation and the modernization of those migrations as well. So if anyone is interested in sort of learning more about the migration programs, it's something that Camwood get involved with on a regular basis. So we can make relevant introductions into Microsoft as well around that piece. Microsoft Viva. So for those of you who don't know what Microsoft Viva is, ultimately it's an employee experience platform. So Microsoft released this, I think, certainly within the last 12 months and put a lot of weight behind it in terms of integrating into the solution stack, but in a very sort of similar manner with Microsoft Teams and working with lots of ISVs. They're working with partners again to ultimately build in direct integrations into other platforms. So again, SAP, other CRM platforms, Workaday, Qualtrics is another one that they've been working with. And ultimately it's allowing seamless integration to ensure that more customers are getting more value out of the platform and out of the product as a whole. Top right, we've got Azure Synapse Analytics. So if anyone doesn't know what Synapse is, ultimately it's a big data analytics platform. So you can integrate multiple different workloads and solutions, things like data warehousing, big data workloads, other data analytics platforms. And what they've been able to do here is, because it's quite a new sort of solution stack, they've been able to work with partners and actually verify and audit them to ensure that customers that do want to work in this type of solution space are going to get the right partners aligned to them. And they go through that through different levels of verification. So when a customer approaches Microsoft and says, hey, we're thinking about moving to this particular platform, Microsoft can then introduce them to the relevant partners that have exposure, experience, and knowledge in this particular area. Azure Arc and Lighthouse. So Azure Arc has actually been a really, really big key differentiator for us as an organization and ultimately our customers. So in simplistic terms, Azure Arc is a baseline of configuration platform, regardless of where your server infrastructure sits. So it can sit in Microsoft Azure, it can sit on premises in a data center, it can even sit in AWS or GCP or SoftLayer, it doesn't really matter. So what Azure Arc allows you to do is control your server infrastructure from an Azure single management plane, so a unified portal, and set your default baselines around sort of configuration, security, update management, and everything sort of built into it. So that's been really key for us as an organization in helping our customers sort of standardize how they're managing their server infrastructure. And then on top of that, extending that out to something called Lighthouse. So Lighthouse is a product or a solution that's been around for a very long time. It's been very sort of prevalent within Microsoft Azure. But Lighthouse ultimately allows partners extend their RBAC and their security controls into a customer's environment. So from a partner perspective, it becomes a unified portal where they can manage all their customers out of directly. And instead of having individual logins for operations teams and partner teams, etc., the customer and the partner can actually use the same login. So an example would be, I can use daniel.williams@camwood.com to access all of my customers across the entire space, and being able to enable that and extend that through Azure Arc has been really, really powerful. So customers get the benefit of simplicity in terms of integration and ultimately sort of baselines and defaults all the way through. And then finally, Dynamics 365, most people should know what it is, but Dynamics 365 is ultimately Microsoft's CRM system. And typically that's been quite a standalone and isolated product, but Microsoft have done a great job integrating more and more product sets into it, things like Power Apps, Power Automate, and then other PaaS workloads within Microsoft Azure. With this enablement, you can actually edit, build out live data within Dynamics 365 directly out of Microsoft Teams now. So there's no need to have sort of disparate and separate solutions everywhere. You can pull them together and integrate them entirely. So of these sort of major announcements, I think it's clear to see that Microsoft are very, very key to ensure that partners are getting the most out of the vendor as a whole and ultimately driving more value into the customer as well. So on to Windows 365. So this is probably the big one everyone's waiting for. over the last sort of 6 to 12 months, it's probably been Microsoft's worst kept secret. So it kind of got leaked probably about eight to 9 months ago, around that sort of time. And ultimately, we knew it was going to be coming, but we didn't know what it was going to be looking like. So Microsoft made the massive announcement around Windows 365, and they put some serious weight behind it in terms of how it looks and feels. So for those of you who don't know what Windows 365 are, please don't get it confused with Microsoft 365. They're two completely different products, but they integrate together nicely. The best way to think of Windows 365 is, if you're familiar with VDI or Azure Virtual Desktop, they are comparative products. Now, Windows 365 is a persistent VDI desktop that can be provisioned on a per license and a per user basis. So that is completely concurrent. It doesn't move, it's persistent, it's there all the time. And you compare that against something like Azure Virtual Desktop, which is, let's call it slightly more enterprise scale and SME scale, that you can build out sort of multi-session, persistent session, single session, personal session around sort of VDI, around that piece. So to dive into more specifics around Windows 365, as you could probably expect, it's aligned to Windows 10. So you can experience Windows 10, and when Windows 11 lands in October, you'll be able to experience Windows 11 as well. And regardless of what device you've got, it could be a Chromebook, it could be a Mac, it could be a Windows device, it doesn't really matter. You're able to access and stream that VDI, that cloud VDI, in a very similar manner as you would be with anything else. And access the full Windows desktop experience as well. So it's important to note that Microsoft are providing the hardware layer, operating system up. That's ultimately what you are responsible for, and what the customer or partner is responsible from that perspective. And there's been some really sort of key changes, and they've borrowed some of the technology from AVD around some of the optimization procedures. So typically, if you're talking about VDI, you're going to have issues around sort of voice calling, video calling, instant messaging, video streaming, etc. Now, what Microsoft have done in AVD is actually optimize all of that and actually offload that onto the physical device, and they've ported that over to Windows 365. So to give you an example, they use something called redirection whenever you're accessing Microsoft Teams or doing a video call or multimedia streaming. So instead of the application consuming resources on the VDI itself, it actually offloads all of that onto your local physical device to perform a much more optimal and better user experience. So I sort of tell everyone to go out and test it out, but ultimately your physical device is doing all the heavy lifting. Your VDI or your Windows 365 device is ultimately just doing the operations and the execution as well. In terms of sort of the use cases, how we see this working, I mean, the rapid deployment model is a real obvious one. So you buy a license from Microsoft or one of your partners, and then you pretty much have the ability to consume and provision a new Windows 365 desktop pretty quickly. So it's a really good use case for organizations that need to provision VDI very quickly. And it's also a good use case for organizations that want to enable things like VDI access for third-party contractors, other customers, and other bits as well. It's still very much applicable for internal staff members as well, but it's really sort of weighing up the cost benefit versus something like Azure Virtual Desktop. And then ultimately, from a control plane and management plane, it's great news that Microsoft out of the box have made the integration within Endpoint Manager sort of straight away. So if you've got any configuration requirements, control access, conditional access, security policies that need to be wrapped into that VDI, you can just treat it as another endpoint. So regardless of physical, virtual, doesn't matter. You can control those utilizing Endpoint Manager and ultimately get the same level of consistency across your entire estate. The image on the right-hand side, I think would be good to just sort of very briefly talk through the different levels and SKUs available. Ultimately, when you purchase a license from Microsoft, you have the ability to pick a different SKU, and the SKU is ultimately aligned to what type of resources you need to consume to it, and it sort of breaks down quite nicely in this image. So at the top, we've got frontline workers, someone that doesn't really need a lot of access to line of business applications or heavy resource consumption apps. So call center workers, people that are out on the road quite a lot just using one app or SaaS-based apps, it can be consumed and allocated through there. And as you start getting deeper through the SKU model, you can see things like, okay, the next level is it will work perfectly for Microsoft 365, but Microsoft Teams voice only because of what's available to it from a consumption model or a resource perspective. And then going all the way down to the really heavy ones, so 8 vCPU, 32 gig of RAM, SSDs, and that's more designed for people that are more graphically intensive, really heavy into resource intensive workloads. So software developers, software engineers, as well as anyone that uses things like AutoCAD, etc. So that's pretty much Windows 365 in a nutshell. We've had fantastic traction around our customer base as well as Microsoft within this. So much so that Microsoft released a free proof of concept, 1 license per customer. As soon as the product launched, they cancelled that after 2 weeks because they ran out of resources to give to people. So it was fantastic to see the uptake, and we see this definitely sort of growing and getting bigger within the marketplace as well. So onto Azure Virtual Desktop, so Windows 365 bigger brother. So nothing's sort of major changed in terms of how the platform works, operates, choose the platform, etc. The major change that we see, aside from the fact that they've rebranded it Windows 365 to Azure 365, Windows Virtual Desktop to Azure Virtual Desktop. That's the best image we can get in terms of how it's been rebranded. And the other piece that's been built on top of it is how organizations are using Azure Virtual Desktop to deliver application desktops to third parties and customers. So it's really important to note that currently nothing's changed in terms of how you can distribute apps and VDI models to your internal staff members at the moment. Nothing changes around that. It's really around how you can deliver SaaS-based applications or SaaS-based desktops to end users and customers. And Microsoft have done a really, really good job around sort of breaking this out from the traditional AVD model, ultimately based on consumption models. They've actually built a new SKU based around whether or not it's an application SaaS provided app, or ultimately an application or VDI that's delivered to SaaS. So like I said, this is perfect for third-party contractors, third-party partners and customers to deliver your applications out in a very sort of simplistic manner. And it's important to note that organizations are still going to pay for the underlying Azure consumption costs on a monthly basis as well. So really, really good announcement. It's great to see Microsoft flexing and actually listen to the community around sort of what they want to see. And we've already seen great adoption with this straight away from customers as well. Microsoft 365 Lighthouse. So this has been a really, really big one for us and our customers. So we've been waiting for this for a very long time. So in a very traditional sense of how you picture Microsoft Lighthouse within a Microsoft Azure portfolio, they've done exactly the same thing with Microsoft 365, which is absolutely fantastic. So everything we were talking about before around Microsoft Lighthouse being a unified portal for partners to access customers' environment and standardize everything, they've extended that out to Microsoft 365 as well, because, Camwood as a partner, we've got lots of customers that utilize Microsoft 365 that we perform services for, but it's very cumbersome and sort of overhead heavy to jump into individual customers' environments to do the administration tasks. So again, just to reiterate that, being able to enable something like Microsoft 365 streamlines the approach of how we integrate into our customers' environments. We can standardize and control all the access our different tiers and our different level of operations teams have, ultimately giving them relevant access and least privileged access into a customer's environment, but at the same time performing optimization and standardization across our customer base. So the customer will get ultimately the proven architecture or the proven solutions that we've applied to all of our other customers. And then we have the ability to bespoke tweak what the configuration requirements and security models are sort of moving forwards. And then as well as that, we get great analytics for all of our customers, as you probably expect within Microsoft 365, but we just get a nice holistic overview in a single pane of glass. I do hate that phrase, single pane of glass, but it is a single pane of glass. And it's fantastic, get a great overview of all our customers across the board. So yeah, again, we see this sort of extending out and getting better as time goes on, but it's a great announcement and a product release for us as a partner, and certainly for our customers as well. And then finally, from a sustainability point of view, I think it's fair to say that carbon emissions and global warming is pretty much on everyone's sort of, the front of everyone's sort of issue list at the moment. And it's great to see Microsoft coming straight out of the gate and saying, okay, we need to do something about this. As a major player in the world, regardless of whether or not it's technology, Microsoft's one of the biggest companies on the globe. They need to make sure they're doing as much as physically possible to reduce the amount of carbon footprint. And it's great to see Microsoft coming out of the gate and saying that. So the key things to take away from a sustainability point of view, Microsoft have put it, as a #1 priority, as a top priority. So the first thing to understand is they're working with a number of different partners and customers to understand and help them how they can reduce the amount of carbon footprint and the amount of carbon consumption they're having on a regular basis. So they're actually doing this through a number of different Azure services. So anything you can imagine from an analytics point of view. They've built out specific carbon connectors to plug into physical hardware to understand how much carbon emissions are getting pulled out of that. And then they're working with partners to create packages of works and solutions to ultimately help customers reduce the amount of carbon footprint they've got, and then flip over to something that's a little bit more sustainable, like renewable energy. And whilst we're talking about renewable energy, it's probably worth noting that Microsoft have come out and said by 2025, all of their entire operations across the globe will be 100% renewable. Now, for an organization like Microsoft to come out and say that is absolutely massive. So if you think about all their operations, you're talking about every single one of their office locations, and that's thousands of office locations across the globe. That's each one of their data centers they've got located across the globe, and that's somewhere in the region of 150 to 200 data centers, and they're absolutely massive in terms of the amount of power consumption. That's one of their big things when they choose a data center location, is how much power can they draw from the local region. And ultimately, the organization coming out and saying that they're going to be 100% renewable by 2025 is absolutely huge, and it's fantastic to see. And more importantly, they're on track to hit that target. It's a really aggressive milestone for them to track against. So fantastic news against that. And one of the ways that they're doing with this is, if you look at one of their data centers, the West data center in Europe, so in Amsterdam at the moment, so one of their flagship data centers, one of the first ones that were launched, and has a large majority of European customers located within. They're actually piloting a 24/7 renewable energy program with an offshore Dutch wind farm to match any power consumption that is coming out of that particular data center. Again, think of size and scale, it's absolutely massive. They will match any data consumption that's being drawn out of that particular data center, and they will replace the power consumption they've got currently with an offshore wind farm at the moment. And that's the kind of model and the different levels of innovation that Microsoft are driving all the way through. So it's really good to see that, and hopefully we'll start seeing that sort of more and more as time goes on as well. And then from a summary perspective, I think Microsoft Inspire this year was different. Everyone was virtual. It was not everything we were all sort of hoping we'd be out of this by now, but I think there is definitely a place for the virtualization of big conferences like that. And certainly, when we're talking about carbon emissions and footprint, stopping people flying all the way to Las Vegas, regardless of where they are in the world, makes a big difference. So summary-wise, product launches were great. Microsoft standing next to the sustainability markers, which is absolutely fantastic. And we're looking forward to what's going to be happening, certainly when Windows 11 gets released in October, and ultimately what starts getting released sort of the early part of next year. So yeah, I just want to say big thank you for everyone joining. Hopefully that was interesting and informative for everyone. But from there, I will hand back to James to answer any questions and anything additionally. So thanks very much, guys.
Brilliant. Dan, thank you. No, that was really good. Appreciate that. Thank you. And as you've said, we've actually had some questions come in whilst you were chatting there. So I'm just going to fire these questions at you, if that's okay. Let's have a look here. Right, here's one to start, actually, probably a good one to start with. From your point of view, what do you think the most important announcement was coming out of Inspire?
That's a really good question. So there's two ways to look at that. So from a technology perspective, hands down, Windows 365. That is going to be an absolute game changer, and it is a direct compete against some other market-leading products out there that have got persistent desktops. So it's great to see that Microsoft have done that. They've listened to the community, and they've seen what everyone else is doing in the market. They've come out with their own product, and the fact that they've integrated it directly in with Endpoint Manager just makes the adoption rate so much easier. So that for me was really important from a technology perspective. From an overall perspective, I think the sustainability model is probably the most important thing that's come out of that, because we all know global warming is a massive problem, and it's fantastic to see that Microsoft, as a global leader, have come out of the gate storming. They've already got programs in place. They're working with customers and partners to help them reduce the amount of carbon footprint, and they're just making it more front and center for people, which is brilliant. So those are the two major announcements for me.
Perfect, that makes sense. And actually that leads well to the second question I have here. When we touched on when you mentioned there from a technology standpoint, Windows 365 was a major announcement. Appreciate you probably touched on this and covered this off already, but it's worth highlighting it. And I think it's a common question. I suspect we're going to get asked a lot in the coming months. How would you say Windows 365 compares to Azure Virtual Desktop?
Yeah, we do get this quite a lot, certainly with customers, because there is a little bit of confusion around sort of one versus the other. So The best way I can sort of explain this in terms of comparative products. So Azure Virtual Desktop has been out for a while. It's a very mature product. A lot of customers are using it. We've had a lot of customers transition from existing VDI into new ones. And ultimately, from an ongoing perspective, I think it fits perfectly from an enterprise model. So if you've got thousands of users that need to utilize things like multi-session, that is absolutely key. And I think that's going to be where it fits in perfectly. On the comparative side, Windows 365 works really well for small to medium businesses as well as SME. And it still has use cases with enterprises, but the model was slightly different. Azure Virtual Desktop takes a long time to plan, migrate, and build out. Windows 365 is very quick and consumable. So if you've got 50 contractors that need to start tomorrow, you just need to buy the licenses, provision all the desktops, and then integrate it into your endpoint manager. That works perfectly. So it's a bit of a balancing act, but I think that the key takeaway is Windows 365 works really well for smaller organizations as well as organizations that need to turn on resources quickly. AVD is certainly a longer term strategy where customers are moving from a traditional VDI into a cloud VDI, and it takes a little bit more planning around that as well.
That makes sense. Thank you. And a final question we have here, actually, which I think, work perfectly for the time we have. Got a question here from a participant. How can they get started with Microsoft 365 and also from a 365 Lighthouse point of view? So probably got someone here who's thinking about providing managed services into a M365 customer base.
So how can you get started with Microsoft 365 from a partner level perspective? So if you're not doing it already, I do sort of advocate that you get in touch with Microsoft. So Microsoft have a fantastic partner ecosystem, and they've got very simple guides around sort of how to transition customers from one solution to another. And they've also got a lot of collateral around how you could have the ongoing conversation with the customer on a regular basis. So they give you PowerPoint decks, they give you technical checklist decks, they give you pricing decks to understand, okay, this is what the solution can potentially look like. And they also give you the customer journey from end to end as well. So that's Microsoft 365. It is a very big topic. So I would advocate, have a look at the partner website around that and get started around that. Failing that, I would get in touch with a tier or an indirect reseller that can help you on that journey as well, that you can resell licenses through. And there's lots of different ISVs out there. And then from an Azure Lighthouse perspective, it's quite an interesting one. I would definitely advocate still get in touch with an indirect partner that can help you down that route, or even someone like Camwood can certainly assist with something like that. But look at the documentation, lab it, have a play around with it, get 2 tenants up and see what you can transition across, because Lighthouse is very simple in terms of the logic behind it. All you're doing is extending your partner security credentials into a customer's environment. But to actually do it and undertake it takes a little bit of work around sort of scripting and ultimately sort of different ARM templates, etc. From that perspective, we're hoping Microsoft are going to make that a lot simpler, where it's just a click through and then you just connect through and that's it. But I would say get in touch with an indirect partner, put it through a lab environment, and do some testing, do some good testing on yourself as well, and then see if you've got any friendly customers that are willing to adopt it as well and sort of work through with you at the same time.
No, that makes perfect sense. Brilliant. Well, look, Dan, really appreciate your time today. I'm sure everybody on the call today on the presentation really enjoyed hearing that. For everyone who did join us today, as Dan just mentioned earlier, many thanks for your time. It's great to see you all here. You can see Dan's contact details there on that final slide. And suffice to say, if anybody does have any questions at all, both immediately in the medium or long-term future, do reach out to us. We're always here to help and always here to advise. So with that, thank you for your time. Hope you have a great rest of the day, rest of the week, and no doubt we'll speak to you soon. Take care. Thank you.